Okay, so today I would like to talk about Glenn Brown. This would be a contemporary painter born in 1966 in England. He's still working to this day. Just going to kind of delve into his technique, um, any sort of fame that he's acquired, any sort of controversy he's stirred up, just generally where I feel that he stands in the contemporary art world. So, just a little bit of an introduction to Glenn Brown. Like I said, born in 1966 in Hexham, Northumberland, England. He's a British artist. He got his BA from BSAD 1988, and he got his MA from Goldsmiths College in 1992. He works with traditional materials, so for the most part, oil on canvas or linen or some type of board or panel. He works in a very realistic and laborious manner. And he's best known for his use of appropriation as his main conceptual element in his work. He also works with technique, like paintbrush technique is also a big thing in his work, but the main theme in his work is appropriation. He's also been considered somewhat of a controversial artist in terms of copyright law versus fair use law, which he's been taken to court various times by both living artists as well as modern artists who have died. Their estates have taken him to court. The biggest one I can think of is the Salvador Dali Foundation has taken him to court before. So that's just a little introduction of him, and there you can see a picture of him on to the left. So we're going to break down into his technique and process now. As I said, his work is very traditional, material and process wise. He uses very flat and realistic techniques to achieve his work via classical oil painting mediums, glazing, that sort of thing. Much of Brown's work is based in part or in total on appropriating the imagery of other artists' work, both classical as well as contemporary, usually realistic but abstracted as well. So, just some examples. Here are a few instant examples of work he's appropriated. He's used artists such as Salvador Dali as well as Rembrandt. So you're looking at different eras he's picked and pulled out. He's also used, if you want to go very recently, he's also used different science fiction artists. Chris Foss is the only name I can think of off the top of my head. That name might not mean too much to too many people because usually illustration doesn't bleed into the fine art world too much. So most people won't recognize too many of those names anyways. Due to the nature of the high detail in Glenn Brown's work, one painting can take anywhere from 4 months to a year. So usually he only gets a few paintings done per year. This is a big difference between him and not just most contemporary artists or painters, but and specific to his region, the British artists of the 90s like Tracy Emin, Jeff Koons, or Damien Hirst. You could even look at Jeff Koons from the United States. Most of these artists work with factories of people that they hire to produce their works. They're sort of like conceptual conductors, from behind the scenes, and then they have like a workshop of people, highly talented and skilled people build the works for them, whether it be paintings or sculptures or installations. That's one thing I find interesting about Glenn Brown is he actually paints these paintings and makes these sculptures, although he's mostly a painter. He does these things himself, which is why he only gets to do, 3 or 4 paintings a year. Some people might scoff at that and think, that's kind of an old hat idea to only do a certain amount of paintings per year because that's only what you can physically do. But that's a big part of what he's doing is examining painting rather than just trying to use a concept and push it with a factory of people. He's examining what it's like to be a painter, and which is why a lot of his later work, up until present day, focuses on actually very flatly painting abstract paintbrush marks. So the lighting and the hills and peaks of the paint, abstract paint, he's painted very flatly in a realistic manner, which is very laborious and time consuming. So yeah, it is more stylized work. It's very illusionary. Like he's taking um, abstract brushwork and painting it very flat and realistic. So there's a um, kind of a play on uh, using realism to paint abstraction. So there's a big his work has a big conversation about what it's like to paint, what it's like to be a painter. So his paintings are paintings about paint. It's art about art, essentially. So just to jump into a little bit of, like I said, appropriation's the biggest aspect of his work, in my opinion, or not necessarily the biggest. It's one of the biggest. There's two main themes, I would say. Appropriation's the main conceptual theme. But like I said, a lot of his work is very technique and process based. So a lot of his work it's about painting, um, which the appropriation aspect works because he's not adding any of his own drawings or his own concepts into the paintings. He's taking them and maybe twisting them a little slight amount. So as it doesn't become kitsch or derivative. It becomes it's almost like an exact reproduction, but it's the colors are changed, or it's he almost makes it so he's taking another person's painting and turning it into a subject, like a model for his own work. And then the rest, the technique aspect, he's just basically uh, demonstrating his take on what painting is, and showing what painting can be. But appropriation, thought I'd jump into it a little bit. So there's two main people know these two types of appropriation. Um, this would be cultural appropriation. We could look at Picasso as a big example for this, borrowing ideas and cultural memes for your own new purpose. A good example can be seen here with Picasso and basically taking African and tribal masks and bleeding that into his style. And that's kind of how Cubism formed itself in the beginning. And then you have art forgery, which is basically attempting to recreate another artist's work with the false pretense of passing it off as an authentic work created by the original artist for financial or some other type of superficial gain. A good example can be seen here with John Myatt, who recreated 19th century paintings fraudulently for financial gain. So basically, the guy you see here with a fake Monet painting behind him, John Myatt, he used to put out um, Monet paintings, or not Monet paintings, 19th century paintings. He used to put out ads in newspapers for those to sell, um, and it wasn't really biting too much. He had a little bit of business, and then a guy came along and basically wanted him to paint them, and then he would sell them as originals. Like he would make them look a little bit aged and sell them as originals. And then he finally just came out to John Wyatt and said, "Hey, I'd like to. I'm in business. I've sold a few of your paintings for X amount of money. Would you like to make fakes and have a business with me?" And the rest is history. He eventually got caught and went to jail, but. So there's a big difference between these two types of appropriation and what Glenn Brown's doing. Glenn Brown is using it more as a conceptual element. He's not trying to pass it off what he does as the original artist, obviously. He's not trying to say that his Dali remakes are made by Dali or something like that. He's taking it and using it as a conceptual element in his work. And he's not, I guess you could say he is culturally appropriating in a sense. Not in the sense of, like a white person going to a party wearing a Mexican hat or something like that. But on every level, you're going to see different cultural ideas. Because you could still say that um, certain painting ideas are part of a certain culture, and it's up for grabs. Anything's up for grabs and able to be interpreted and poked around at this point in history. So yeah, I guess you could say part of what he does has a little element of that. And again, I would say art forgery is definitely something you got to stay away from, but cultural appropriation is something that's pretty much unavoidable since the dawn of time. It's been happening. But I would say definitely a little bit of that could be seen in his work, I guess, if you depends on how you look at it. But moving on to some examples of his work. So here's some of his early work. You see on the right, this would be Dali Christ. So, and then on the left, you could see Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War by Dali. So it's very similar. The colors haven't changed much. Only difference would be is Dali bought his paint set in the 30s, and Glenn Brown got his in the 90s. So there's 60 years difference roughly of when their materials were purchased. So and likely, they come from different schools of thought. So there's probably a little bit different ideas and like what materials they use. I'm pretty sure Glenn Brown used something like Winsor Newton, and I know for sure Dali used blocks, and blocks uses very historical pigments. So Dali's probably uses lead white, a true cerulean blue, and Dali was a Renaissance man when it comes to his work. I've studied his work very in detail, and I'm starting to study Glenn Brown's work in very high detail as well. So there's little nitpicky things that you can get into if you really want to go down the rabbit hole and understand why and how these painters made what they made. But you can see here the image. There's really no difference in brushwork either. Brushwork and color are essentially the same. The only main difference you can see here between these two paintings is Glenn Brown's has changed the proportions of the actual canvas. So he's taken his and placed the image into a traditional portrait proportion, like what a portrait canvas would be sized at. He's used those proportions, and I'm assuming early in the Renaissance, that's what typically would be used to paint like a portrait of Jesus or the Virgin Mary or something, or someone of high importance. Portraits are usually attributed to someone of high importance. So that's where he gets the title for this, Dali Christ. So he's taken the image completely, didn't mess with it at all, just changed the proportion of the actual canvas that it would be painted on. And the colors, like I said, aren't different other than the fact that the pigments are from different time periods and they use different materials. Dali's is more golden looking, and there's a reason for that. Dali used amber varnish. He used an amber resin in his paint, which is why a lot of them have a certain gold glow to them. Plus, they're a little bit older, quite a bit older. Like I said, Dali was a Renaissance man. Glenn Brown, and I've seen in videos he uses Winsor Newton. I'm assuming he still does. Him being from England, that doesn't surprise me. Plus, that's kind of the go-to paint brand that people go to. I personally am a materials nerd myself and dig a little bit deeper than that. I use Rublev, but that's for another time. So on to another one of his paintings. Okay, so here's one that he kind of got in trouble for. And I'm pretty sure he got in trouble for the previous one I just showed you. I know he got in trouble for a Dali painting that he did. He got taken to court by the Dali estate, basically you're only going to get in trouble for doing this sort of thing if you end up making a lot of money or a lot of publicity about what you're doing. Most people, if you're just in, a basement or a random studio somewhere, reproducing something detail for detail, color for color, size for size, unless you're making I guess 6 digits or more, or you're like in the newspaper or something, you're probably not gonna hear about it. If you're making a few thousand off of it, whatever, you're not gonna get chased down, most likely. You never know. But here is one of the science fiction pictures that Glenn Brown copied. So here, this one's even closer to the original. So this would be by Chris Foss, The Stars Like Dust, made in 1986, and then Glenn Brown, Ornamental Despair, 1994. So this is an illustration. Glenn Brown's is a large painting version of Chris Foss's. Chris Foss's is a small. I'm not sure the materials they use, which is why I didn't include it. I'm assuming it might be like a watercolor or acrylic or something smaller, because I'm pretty sure Glenn Brown mentioned that it was a smaller work itself. I do know Glenn Brown's is an oil painting. He's typically an oil painter. Chris Foss actually went to a museum where I believe this painting was hanging, and he demanded it to be taken down, and he was upset, and I believe he took Glenn Brown to court as well, and I believe they settled on something, and they went about their business. There was also controversy in the year 2000. Glenn Brown was nominated for the Turner Prize, not for this painting, but for another science fiction painting by another science fiction illustrator. He appropriated that one as well, and he was taken to court over that. So he's been taken to court a few times. So he definitely straddles the line of what fair use can be. So here you can see this one's very similar to the original by Chris Foss, but the biggest change is you could see the colors have been hyped. At least that's the biggest thing I can really see, is the colors have been hyped. That's the main difference, really, and that became a theme in his later work, as he hyped the colors and kind of made it look like toxic or I don't know, like poisonous or like rotten or something. I don't know. Yeah. So here is an example of his interpretation of impasto paint, but painted very flatly. So this would be a reproduction of Frank Arbach. So here on the left you have Frank Arbach's Head of JYM, 1973, and you can see it's very painterly. You can even see the brush strokes in the on the canvas. And here on the right you could see a similar image, obviously based off that, by Glenn Brown, called The Real Thing. Not sure if that was ironically titled or not. Made in 2000, and you could see it looks like the paint's really gestural, but it's not. It's actually very flat, and you can even see in certain sections he has kind of warped the image to where it looks like it's a Photoshop image, and that's interesting because Glenn Brown is one of the best examples I can use of using Photoshop as a tool in how he can render his images. So he's actually rendered the images in Photoshop prior to pulling them out into a painting. So he's probably taken the Frank Arbach image on the left, put it in Photoshop, played with it, and then this is what he got. And then he painted what he got. And like I said, there's a big emphasis on painting with Glenn Brown. There's a very strong emphasis on traditional painting, hand to canvas. So no workshop of imps like not Glenn Brown, but like Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst or Tracy Emin working for you, but the actual artist and the canvas, and high realism instead of just big concepts and people working for you. There's high realism and hand to canvas work. This is very interesting for me because it's harder for me to connect to post-60s art, just because I find a lot of it is too conceptual, it's too minimal, it's too out of reach, too hard to connect to. It's very subjective. There's not too much objectivity to it. There's not a lot of there's not a lot of emphasis on craftsmanship or medium specificity. Sorry, can't pronounce today. So stuff like Damien Hirst or Tracy Emin, it's very conceptual and it's very detached from the actual artist. It's more of, like I said, a conceptual conductor behind the scenes, hiring a bunch of people to make a very minimal, non-medium specific subjective experience. Glenn Brown's kind of the opposite of that. So he's one of the I guess you could say postmodern contemporary artists that I can really get into. So here's this will be the final example of his work that I'll be showing. This is an example of the way he paints now. The opening image was a good example as well, which I'll go back to. But here you could see he takes this lamb. I'm not sure the exact reference. Couldn't find the title or the year for this one, but I do know this is the way he paints now. You can see how the colors are hyped. Obviously, the lamb wouldn't have all this color into it, but in here he adds it. He makes it look very fleshy and kind of impasto a little bit, very expressive, but again, it's very flat, which is very laborious and time consuming to mimic expressive brush marks in a very flat and realistic manner. And it goes back, like I said, to the fact that he wants to create a very traditional and realistic experience and hands-on, objective. This is the painter. He's doing a, very laborious painting. It's like it goes back to the whole idea of the genius artist in their studio, slaving away at something. I like that. So here is one of my paintings that I'd like to kind of relate back into the Glenn Brown discussion a little bit. Like I said, this is one of the only contemporary artists or painters that I can really get into and relate to. I mean, there's more, but it's a minority because most of postmodernism and most of the 1960s up until present, a lot of it's hard for me to get into. A lot of it's performance and video and installation and conceptual and very it's identity based, and it's very hard for me to get into because it's very subjective and not medium specific. Like there's a very small emphasis on craftsmanship or objectivity. It's very, like I said, it's very conceptual and like kind of up in the air and floating around, and it's hard to get into for me personally. So here is a painting that I did, and I have my own formula for this type of work. This is a type of work that it's not my main type of work, but it is kind of a side branch of work I'm getting into doing. I guess it's my more contemporary work. You could relate it more to a contemporary theme. My other work's more expressive and it's more of like a gritty, abstract, surreal type of work. But this type of work that I'm doing is fairly similar to Glenn Brown's. But I have a couple examples, but this is the one I'm going to use. So on the left you have Salvador Dali's Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, done in 1954. And on the right you have The Father is Present, after Dali, 2015. So I just did this last year. And as you could see, it's the same image. It's actually the same exact size. So I didn't change the proportions or the size of the painting. That's something that Glenn Brown used in his work, and he's played around with the proportions quite a bit, actually. He took a Dali painting that was about war, and he stretched it to the proportions of Guernica, and he actually changed the color pattern to Guernica, but it was still a Dali painting. But he was using Picasso's Guernica color and canvas proportions to do it, which I thought was interesting. But that's not how I wanted to approach the appropriation concept. I essentially strictly used a Renaissance palette. So I took Dali's painting and I recreated it only using Renaissance colors, which works because Dali was like I said, he was a modern day Renaissance man. So I used stuff like lapis lazuli. As you could see, the cloak that Gala is wearing in my painting, and the undergarment that the figure on the cross is wearing, those are lapis lazuli. That's not ultramarine. And you can tell it's a little bit more earthy looking than ultramarine would be. And I used true genuine vermilion for the hair and part of the garment on Gala as well. Naples yellow for the four squares around the figure on the cross and the garments on Gala. And these have Renaissance meanings that can connect to the materials. If you look at Renaissance paintings by Van Eyck or that's another one. Just anyone who painted religious paintings at that time. Van Eyck's a good one to pull up. Well, especially the earlier Renaissance paintings, color was a big thing. Like there was a lot of paintings that the color was simple. They'd use simple primary color patterns to signify certain things. So I look at the way I'm trying to do these reproduction paintings as limiting to a early Renaissance type of look. So if you look at the early Renaissance paintings, figures of high significance are cloaked with lapis lazuli, especially the Virgin Mary, and that comes into big play here because in Dali's painting, he's making his wife Gala the Virgin Mary standing under the crucifix, while whoever it is on the crucifix is supposed to be Jesus. So I basically went a step further and just made his wife the Virgin Mary by giving her the attire of the early Renaissance. You have the lapis lazuli, the vermilion, and the Naples yellow, true Naples yellow. Although, to be fair, earlier on they also used orpiment, which is another yellow pigment from back then, as the yellow for royalty. I'm using Naples yellow, which was used 1600s, 1700s-ish. So yeah. Interchangeable, but yeah. So I basically transformed his wife into what he was trying to signify her as. So yeah. And yeah, the paint brand I used was Rublev. It's a very historical paint manufacturer. So the way Glenn Brown tackles his work, I think it's more process. He focuses more on the process aspect. I focus on the process, and I want to focus on the materials as well. So I'm only using lead whites. There's no zinc or titaniums. I'm not using synthetic. There's certain synthetic ones that you can't get away from, but for the most part, like I said, I'm trying to stick to an older palette or a more natural palette. So yeah, this just tossing my little experience in there. And again, this isn't my main type of work, but this is something I'm very interested in. And I'd also like to recreate a Glenn Brown painting using this color palette. So I wouldn't change. I'd use the exact same size as Glenn Brown used on his painting, but I would use my color palette. So in my work, in my appropriation work, I'm not changing the size of the canvas. The only thing I'm changing are the colors. And then the painting will inevitably change because another hand is at work. So those are the only two differences you'll see. So moving right on. So my consensus. I've come to a very good example of material specificity, or specificity. Okay, sorry. It's a hard word for me. In contemporary painting, much of painting has, and fine art in general has, moved away from objective craftsmanship and medium specificity. Glenn Brown is a very good example of objective craftsmanship in his highly detailed and well-rendered paintings. Brown's paintings are very flat and very traditional in their execution, utilizing glazing techniques, flatness, and high realism. I feel as if I can engage myself with Glenn Brown's work from both a conceptual as well as a material and craftsmanship point of view, as it is both relevant and technically superb. So that's my take on Glenn Brown and appropriation in general, and kind of how I relate to it. most of my work isn't isn't like that, but it is a side branch that I'm kind of getting into, just as a way to make more contemporary relevant work, I guess. Because a lot of the work I make is I've even been had it deemed as outsider work, like outsider art, just because it's not very. It's not about identity or appropriation or reproduction. It's not about any of the main themes, so it's kind of it doesn't really fit into any of the high end discussions, I guess. But yeah, so that's my thoughts, and I have just this question for you guys: do you find Glenn Brown an accurate representation of where painting is going? If so, is this a hopeful direction? Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.